Today's video is all about Linocuts or block printmaking. I am using Blick Wondercut linoleum. You can also use a rubber stamp, and I'm using lino cutters to create a simple black and white image of a cupcake that prints beautifully. If you love learning about art, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a weekly tutorial. Materials are in the description box, but you will need a piece of linoleum, a set of lino cutters, a brayer, ink, and lots of paper that you want to print on. The first step to a successful print is knowing what you want to print. I always prefer to do a sketch first on a separate piece of paper because it's just easier to erase than on linoleum. I'm going to be doing a very simple cupcake today, and I'm not thinking so much about subject matter as far as like telling a story. This is just a way to learn how to use the materials. So you want to pick an object that has clear areas of black and white and lots of lines. Printmaking is all about line, shape, and contrast between your dark and your light areas. I'm thinking black and white, so the paper I print on will be white and then the ink will be black. This of course can change. You can use whatever color paper you want and whatever color ink that you want, but it usually helps my brain to think about it simple black and white, and then I can be creative once I have my image. Then you will take whatever image you're using, cut it out, and then sketch it onto your linoleum or trace it directly using tracing paper, carbon paper, or you can use this graphite paper that I'm using to transfer your image. If you don't have graphite paper, you can take your pencil and shade on the back of your drawing, flip it over, put it on top, and draw over it, and your pencil line should transfer. Check your work often though, because there's nothing more frustrating than not having your image transfer. You'll notice that I am using a pen. That way I know which lines I have traced and which lines I have not. So again, the best way to have a successful print is to do a lot of planning, prepping, and sketching beforehand. Carving is a lot more challenging than drawing because you can't erase. Once you carve it, it's gone. So you need to be aware going in what your lines are going to look like, and you'll hear me say this a lot, those big areas of dark and light. Contrast is key, and you want to really think about that in the simple image that you're going to be printing. Okay, so it transferred pretty well. I'm going to go back over it, so there's a lot of repetition. And here are some examples of some really simple clip art images. I stole these from the internet. These are not my drawings or original ideas, but that's a great place to start. And my students definitely used these when they were doing their practice print. I'm going to take a Sharpie and outline again. And I know it seems like a lot of repetition. First you sketch, then you transfer, then you're going to add more lines, but I promise, do the hard work now, map it out, because when you have your lino cutter in your hand, you want to know exactly what lines stay black, exactly what areas to carve, and unless you've done this a whole bunch, you want to map it out first. You can see with my Sharpie, I am making my lines thicker than they were because I want to make sure when I carve that I don't miss anything, and small lines are really hard to carve. I'm going to speed things along because this is just me tracing things with a Sharpie. I really like to take a Sharpie and do a border. You can see a black line all the way around because that gives it a really nice print, especially because this is just like one simple image. I'm prepping now to carve, and I am taping down my tiny piece of linoleum to my tabletop so it doesn't move around. You can also use something called a bench hook, but I don't have enough for my students. I have 39 students in one class, so we do the old-fashioned tape your linoleum to your table. Now let's talk about the blades that you will be using. The set of lino cutters that I have stores the blades in the handle. So that's where the blade should stay, or the cutter should stay, when you're not using them. To change out the blade, you simply turn the top metal handle to the left. So righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, and that will loosen the two pieces that meet together in the center. Then you can pull and remove out the cutter. And then if you see there's an open gap between the pieces on the inside, put that down in there and turn it towards the right. It does take some practice, and be careful because if you take the lino cutter all the way apart, there are some internal pieces that can fall apart and get lost, and if you lose them, it's not going to work anymore. Okay, so first rule, always cut away from yourself. Keep your hands away from the blade. If you have ever used lino cutters before, and if you've ever cut yourself, it can be very painful because the momentum, you're pushing up and you're pushing against the grain of a material. And so if you lose traction, your hand and your blade will go flying. So So as you can see, the tape is keeping it in place, and you can use your hand to push down as well, but make sure that your hand is completely out of the way of the direction of your blade. Safety first. The next thing you need to know is that you're not scooping. A lot of times students want to use it like a shovel, but instead think about it like you're water skiing or you are ice skating. So your cutter should glide across the surface parallel with the linoleum, not digging down like a shovel. It definitely takes practice, and you will press your blade down a little bit, but again, you're not scooping, you're gliding across the surface. I highly recommend using a variety of lino cutters. I'm starting in my background because that's a non-threatening area. If it's black, you leave it, and if it's white, you carve it. Again, this will change depending on the color ink that you use and the color paper, but I'm thinking just simply black and white because it makes my brain feel a little bit better. So I'm gonna start with the background because I want my background to be carved away completely. And you can see I'm using one of the larger cutters. If you look, each blade has a number on it. 1 and 2 are the smallest. 3 gets a little bit bigger. For some reason, 4 is skipped in this set, and then 5 is the biggest one. We do have a blade that's number 6, and that one looks kind of like a leaf, and it's very sharp. I actually removed that one, and my students don't use it because I had a student one time cut herself and have to get stitches. So we just skipped that blade because I'm doing this in a public school setting, and I don't want to be sending students to the hospital. So be careful. It is a sharpened metal cutter, a sharpened metal blade, and it can hurt you. It's really important to really get your lines tight. So you can see in the background space, I'm trying very carefully to respect the lines that I drew. That's why I was saying at the beginning to really sketch things out, be aware of where your lines are. If it's black, shade it in. Don't trust yourself, because I don't trust myself, to remember what's black and what's white. Do what's easiest for your brain, and that is to map it out, color it in, so you don't have to do any thinking while you're carving. By the way, if you think that I'm going really fast, it's true. I sped this up a little bit, actually twice the speed I actually did it, since you've seen me use the same blade and carve the same section. A lot of times students ask me, does it matter how deep I carve? And the answer is yes and no. The deeper you carve, the more chance it's going to be pure white. And if you carve lightly, when you do it on the printing press at the very end, you might see some of those textured marks, which is nice. But if you don't want that, if you want it to be completely solid white, you don't have to carve all the way down. You just need to carve enough so that you can see that there's no lines that are going to be showing up. I'm going to go ahead and change the blade. So lefty-loosey, I'm going to twist the metal top. I'm going to remove the handle. Then I'm going to twist it all the way closed. I'm going to take out the blades, and I like to pour them in the palm of my hand. If I pour it on the table, sometimes they fall on the floor. I'm going to take another size. You can see the number on the back. And then I'm going to put the blades back in the handle, close it so they don't fall out while I'm carving, and always get in the habit of putting the blades back just so you don't lose them. Turn the metal part to the left so that it loosens up, put the blade in the space or the gap, and then you tighten it up to close the gap between the metal pieces so the blade doesn't go anywhere. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you get it, you'll never forget how to change the blade. I switched my cutter to the number 2, which is the second smallest or thinnest cutter, and I'm going in for some detail work in the cake part of the cupcake. This is one of the best parts of the drawing because you have these lines that are going to print really nice. Make sure that you pay attention to the lines that you drew. Remember, if it's black, you keep it, and if it's white, you carve it. I know that's kind of difficult. That's why going in with the Sharpie is really important. It's basically the opposite of drawing. You're carving out the areas that you want to go away, and then you're leaving behind the areas that you want to capture the ink and print black or whatever color ink you're going to be using. I'm trying to kind of get in there now that I have a smaller cutter because that's a tight space, and the larger number 4 or number 3 cutter didn't quite cut it. Get it? And so those edges and outlines and where lines meet are really important to get a good print. Let's speed things up again since you've seen me do this before. Going around the background area again with my smaller cutter to make sure that my lines are very clear. And there's clear definition between the background, the cupcake, and of course the black border that goes all the way around. Always think in the size cutter that you're using. So it's kind of annoying and frustrating to switch your cutter all the time. So kind of think, okay, large spaces, medium-sized spaces, and then small lines and spaces, and kind of use your cutter in each section according to the line variety and thickness and thinness thickness and thinness that you plan to be creating. Let's get into the icing. Still using that number 2 carver, the second smallest one. I love the smallest one for fine lines, but this is still a, reasonably larger area. This is such a small, tiny little print. You can see I'm turning the direction of my cutter and moving my fingers as I do it. And I know that my linoleum is taped to my table, but all I have to do is pick it up and move it and shift directions if I feel like I want to kind of change where my hand is moving. Muscle memory is really key, so if you feel more comfortable carving up rather than horizontally, just move your linoleum as you go. But again, safety first, tape it down or use a bench hook so that it has something to stop it when the momentum of your carving gets out of control. I'm gonna flip it around, and now that I have my background finished and most of the cupcake itself, it's time to get those really fun swirly lines in the icing and the cherry so that it is a nice solid print. I'm going to speed things up again since you are repeating what you've seen me, or I'm repeating what you've seen me do before. And I am going to switch the blade. Right now I'm using the number 2, and I'm going to switch to the smallest one and put some really fine lines and details in there with the number 1 smallest lino cutter. I can see my lines really well here because I went over it with thick lines with the Sharpie, but a trick to see what your print will look like before actually printing it is take a thick Sharpie or a black marker and rub it all over your carved lines, and it should show you exactly what you've carved and give you an idea of what your lines are going to look like when printing. So if you didn't outline it in Sharpie and you're having a hard time seeing what your lines are and you're not ready to print, you want to test it, grab a marker, overlap over your lines, and it should give you a fairly accurate depiction of how your ink is going to stay on the surfaces that you did not carve. I think I'm almost done. You can see this smallest carver is really great for adding those smaller lines, and we'll see what those look like once I print. And I am kind of adding some lines that I didn't actually draw because I want more line variety in the cupcake wrapper. It is time to print, and I will be using Speedball black printing ink. Block printing ink is the type of ink you want to use. I know that's confusing because I said black. It's black block printing ink, and that will make sure that it stays in all your lines and crevices. You need something called a brayer, which is this rolly tool you see me using, and you need a surface to roll your ink on. Then put down newspaper because you're about to watch see what happens there. You need to, on a dirty surface, like on top of a newspaper or scratch paper, take the brayer and roll it over your linoleum. I highly recommend not doing this on your bare tabletop because then you'll have a bigger mess. And using printing ink is kind of like honey. It gets everywhere. It's messier than paint if you make a spill, in my opinion. On a clean surface, it's time to print. You leave your linoleum on the tabletop, put paper over it, and then you can use your hands, a clean brayer, a wooden spoon, whatever you have for your print. You can see I had a little bit of ink on my finger there. And you're going to rub and touch every surface of your linoleum with your hand or whatever tool you're using to make sure that it's actually printing. If you just press your paper and lay your palms over it and try to give it CPR, that's what my students always do. They press down on it. That's not going to transfer all the fine lines and details. And then when you pull your print, boom, you can be sure that it's a really clean, crisp print. Let's try this again. This time I got smarter and laid my linoleum on scratch paper. You do need to re-ink, so I rolled it in that ink there, going multiple directions with my brayer, making sure that it's covering all the lines that I left behind. Then wash your hands if you got a bunch of ink on it. Find a clean surface, which means you might move to another tabletop or you might clean the area that you're working in currently. Remember, you're not giving your artwork CPR. Take your hand and go over multiple times, pressing into the ink, pressing into the areas that you want the ink to stick to your paper, especially around those edges. And do this as many times as you feel comfortable, and you'll start to see kind of an indentation in your paper. Then it's time to pull your print, and that's when the magic really happens. Voila, that one's really nice. Thank you so much for sticking around and making art with me. And if you're interested in more tutorials, check these out. Find me on Instagram at thatartteacher_Machado to see what my students are up to in my classroom, and find my website, thatartteacher.com, for all of my full-length lesson plans and free resources.